Now, I'm looking rather tatty this morning, but so be it. So there we are, Charleville, a view from Lower King Street. What I want to do at the moment, tatty as I am, I haven't got my production team in to do my hair up, and it's pretty cold this morning, but still, look, we have to live with it. But I thought I'd better get in and give a general description of what it is that I've been intending with these videos that I have made and put on YouTube. They're not polished productions. The only thing I know is that I've put a camera on this stand and press a button, things will start. Lighting may be okay, lighting may not be okay, sound may be okay, sound may not be okay. I make mistakes, I do all sorts of terrible things, and I don't know how to correct them, and I don't intend spending any time in becoming an expert on video editing or video production, because time is of the essence. If time was not of the essence, then, well, maybe I would do all of these things and maybe I would do a very slick sort of production, but I haven't got time for that. I'm 84, and, well, as you well know, I could be taken tomorrow. On the other hand, I may not be taken for some time. I mean, I could be struck down by a bus, I could be assassinated, or I could go through, a plague or something like that. I don't really know. But as I could be gone by tomorrow, it's best just to get in and do it. And, they say don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so I would try to do some good, but I haven't got time for the perfect. I've always been very interested in Charleville's history. I derived this, or gained this interest, I suppose, from my old Uncle Tom. That's my grandfather's brother, Tom Bilby. And Tom was one of three brothers, and Tom had a fair bit of polish about him. He was a real gentleman, and he was a great raconteur. But he had a most amazing set of stories of the early days of Charleville. I think Uncle Tom was born in about 1892. I wouldn't swear to that, but we'll say about 1892. And I first became aware of Uncle Tom in in an intelligent form in the 1940s, perhaps early 1950s. So that, he was a middle-aged man by that time, or about 60 by that time, I suppose. And but he kept me entertained, of course, but he sparked in me an interest which I have continued on over these many years, even though in those many years I spent only my very early years in Charleville. But since then I visited from time to time, but whether I'm there or whether I'm not, I'm always taking an interest in what's going on in the town. But I discovered along the way that even though Uncle Tom may be gone, the National Library of Australia has a facility called Trove, which is a record, a photographic record, we'll call it that anyway, an online record, of the contents of all of the early newspapers throughout Australia. And I think, I don't know where the limit is, but I know I tried to look up something beyond 1954, and I think the Trove files may end in about 1954, but I wouldn't be sure of that. But my interest was generally earlier than that, and I found that Trove, with many years of searching Trove and making notes and gathering articles, allowed me to get a pretty good picture of the period in which I was interested, and that was the very early years, and then the years through to about 1901. After that, the newspaper articles become rather dull because they were employing, sort of full-time journalists, we might call them that, I suppose. But after about 1901, the newspaper articles weren't really very interesting at all. They would have stated fact, one hopes, but they were not interesting. But if you take the newspaper articles in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and so on, well, you let it all hang out, and there was no holds barred. You said what you thought, and if it was what you wrote was printed in one paper, it was printed in another, and so I was inspired to get on and do that. And then, of course, I used to hear, and still do hear and read on the internet, what purported to be stories of Charleville's history. And I kept on reading about 1868 and Tully and all that sort of thing. And, well, 5 minutes research tells you that that's all nonsense, but there it was. And so I got in and I did a fair bit of work on that and tried to get that sorted out. And so what have I tried to do here? What I'm trying to do is propose rather than propose, a series of videos, for many of you probably too lengthy, but I'm thinking of posterity. Some student in 100 years' time may find them interesting in their entirety. And but I wanted to do something that falls into 3, and you never know, maybe into 4 parts. The first part will be a series of, a series of videos dealing with aspects of Charleville's history in those very early years, and specifically in the first years from about 1860, I begin about 1862, but essentially from about 1864 through to about 1870. I may venture a little bit beyond that maybe from time to time, but that really is my interest, because there is this, what I call received history of Charleville, most of which has been wrong, and its excuse generally for both its brevity and its inaccuracy is that there's very little information available. But, well, that's not quite so. If ever you get any access to these 8 volumes of work that I've done, you'll discover that there's plenty of information there. It's just that no one ever looked, or no one was really able to look, because what allows me to look has been the internet and the Trove National Library facility. Several people did attempt to write histories of Charleville. Alan Morrison, he was a teacher in Charleville School, he wrote an essay. It's quite an entertaining essay. He must have prepared it in the late 30s, 40s, and I think he first delivered it in around about 1945. It's a really interesting piece of work. It's got all sorts of inaccuracies in there, and but when I say all sorts, there are a number of inaccuracies that I know in the period that I know something about. But you must forgive him, because how did he get it? He was in Charleville for the most part. He had no access to the internet. There would have been no great record of, or no great collection of historical records in Charleville at the time, because, as he says, Charleville fires did tend to burn most things, and so there really wasn't there. And he got a lot of his information just from talking to people, and I can tell from some of the stuff he wrote that he consulted a few things that appeared in the Charleville Times and the Western Star, I think probably in the 1940s, about the time of the centenary celebrations. And so you can forgive him for any errors that are there, but if you like to check his work against others, you can soon get rid of the errors. But it's a very entertaining piece of work. A. Morrison, and if you look up that Charleville A. Morrison on Trove, you'll get many versions of it. And then later on in 1991, I think it was, Claire Wagner, she did a book called Charleville Town. It's very good, very good. It's good. It's got a few errors in it because she too had no access to the internet. Oh, it was a great work, I can tell you. And she deserves many, many medals for what she did. And she worked, reading the film copies in the library here in Brisbane and so on. And she derived part of her information from, say, Alan Morrison and people like that. But her work is really very fine work. It's called Charleville Frontier Town. Sadly, of course, it was not popularly received. I think maybe people didn't like her style, or maybe people found it a little bit hard going. I'm not quite sure. But it really is a superb piece of work. And when I first met her, I don't know when that would have been, probably in about 2000 or 2010 or something like that, she told me that all of these copies of her work had been printed, but most of them were in boxes stored in a spare room in her house in, I think it was Clayfield she was living, or somewhere like that. And a very great pity, because it really is a very good piece of work and, and very entertaining. Claire had a very definite view of things, and she described some of the, shall we say, personalities and events of the time with that very wonderful sense of humour that she has. And so I've used them partly, but basically I've dealt the first part of what I'm doing from the trove sources. Those trove sources simply cover those first 3 years. They attempt to give you an outline of the history of the very early years, and then they attempt to, if you like, solve some of the mysteries, because if you look at the history in those first couple of years, there are some things about which we're left a bit in the dark, and things happened, and you get a few clues as to what may have happened, but they're what I call sort of dots, and every now and then you've got to fill in the dots with a certain amount of speculation. And a large part of the first part of what I've done attempts to fill in and solve those mysteries with a certain amount of speculation, but not just wild speculation, but speculation based on the general circumstances of the time and what I think are fairly honest guesses, if you like, about what really went on and what really happened. Now, I can't guarantee the absolute accuracy of all of that stuff. For instance, there's one section there dealing with a fellow called Mazarath from Roma, who was involved surreptitiously in a lot of things that went on in the early days in Charleville. But of course he was a rogue, and you can find nothing of, above the counter. Everything went on below the counter. And so I've had to make some speculation there. But my speculation is, if not entirely accurate, certainly reasonable and probably fairly close to it. That's the first part of what I was doing. The second part of what I planned was to do what generally doesn't happen in history. History, as you well know, is generally written by the winners, shall we say. It's generally written by the elite and about the elite. But I wanted to write how we saw Charleville down our end of town, and maybe from in a way, not so much from our family's point of view, but from the point of view of the people who lived in what I call Lower King Street. Lower King Street was not the fashionable end of town. As you well know, there's the golf links over there, but if you go over the gully, you've got the cemetery and you've got the sewage treatment works. And in my childhood days, over the river, over the gully, was known as the Sand Hill, or the Sandies, and that's where a lot of old pensioner huts were to be found. I don't know what's there now. Maybe it's a salubrious suburb, perhaps. I don't really know. But in those days, it had the three things: the pensioner huts, the cemetery, and the sewage treatment works. That part of town, and it's a very small part of town, it's only King Street, Carter Street and May Street. That really is about it. But it's the view of Charleville from that part of town and those people. Those people were not entirely horsey people, but largely horsey people, or, bushworker people. My family was shearers, rogues to some extent. But if you go down the road, you've got the Gordons, they were drovers. There's a horse trainer there called Nugget Smith. Let me see. Over the road from us was Bill and Elsie Turvey. A lot of empty blocks. And if you went around, up on the far corner, I think there may have been the Kennedys who had the horse stables up on the far corner. And not very far from them, on the corner of Parry Street and West Street, you had the Goodmans with their goats. Then if you went down into Carter Street, you had more horsey people. There was the Davidsons there. These were horsey people. When I say horsey people, they were not droving people as the Gordons were. They were racehorse people. And then there were a variety of other families that were there. They weren't like us, part a rogue and or part horsey. They weren't horsey and they weren't rogue. In Carter Street there was a family there, Mrs. Creevy, and she had a son and a daughter. And I don't know. I can remember talk about theirs being at high school or whatever. So they were neither horsey nor were they rogues or shearers or whatever else, you see. And then if you go down a little bit further, you had, you've got to come back into King Street. And down near Cunnamulla Road, there was a family there called Hayes. 3 Hayes children, as I recall, and they were bright, but they were not horsey and they were not rogues. And there was Rennie and I can't remember the daughter's name. And then there was a younger boy who was the age of one of my uncles. But for the most part, though, they were sort of tended to be horsey, rural type people. For most of those people, not a great deal of education. They were generally poorly educated. But I'm wanting to show the picture of Charleville as we saw it down that end of town. We were not the winners, I can assure you of that. My family were not the winners, and most of the other people in the area were not winners either. But we had a view of the town, and so what I do in the second part is give you some insight into the colour of the town, if you like, in the 1940s, but not from the point of view of the elite and not from the point of view of the well-educated people, but from the point of view of the lower orders, if you like, the lower orders who very rarely get into history. Now, and there's an additional element of that. I'm giving you that point of view, but I'm giving you the point of view from a child of about, say, around about 10, sometimes a bit younger than that, sometimes a bit older than that, but I start remembering things in that area from about 1941. Very primitive things, of course. But I knew what people talked about, what people were interested in, and so I tell you the stories that they told. Now, those stories, we find great entertainment in them, but they're the stories that a 10-year-old heard. I make no guarantee about anything more than that. They are stories that I heard as a 10-year-old or thereabouts. Some of those stories are certainly true. If I tell the story about our family, largely true, shall we say, and maybe they're a little bit coloured. Many of the other stories were stories that were told, but the degree of truth in them I can't guarantee, because, sometimes people talk, and their talk contains an element of truth, but sometimes, there's a certain degree of, shall we say, creativity, fabrication, and there may be a grain of truth in them, but they tend to have been coloured. And because most of these stories are very well coloured, I remember them quite well. The stories that I tell about the people, if I claim to have known the people, you can be fairly sure that the stories were fairly accurate, but accurate insofar as a 10-year-old would see them from a distance, because remember, in those days, children of that age were supposed to be seen but not heard. And I tended to follow the rule of being seen but not heard, but I had an additional element to that. I may have been seen and I may not have been heard, but I certainly listened. And I had a good memory, and I don't think I was supposed to understand very much. But I think I understood most things, and in addition to understanding most things, I remembered most things. And so, in the spirit of Lower King Street of the 1940s, I retell some of the stories. Okay, then. I then have a third section planned, and if I'm not taken, then I will get on with it and begin on it fairly soon. What I wanted to do in that section was to describe what you might call the nuts and bolts of everyday life. How did people live in the 40s? How different was life in the 40s for ordinary people from what it is now or from what it will be in the future? I wanted to describe, like my childhood routine, the routine of our family, the routine of the other people who lived in the street, the routine of my brother and sister, the routine of my cousin just down the road. Then I wanted to get into the house. What was in your kitchen? How did you cook? How did you wash the dishes? What sort of cooking implements did you have? Then I'd range through the house. Did you keep the house warm? Could you keep the house warm? How did you protect yourself from the dust? How did you keep warm in winter? How did you overcome the problem that down our end of town we had cold bore water in winter, boiling water in summer? How did you have a bath in summer in that boiling bore water? Oh dear, it was a problem. It was one of these things that you planned and then put off until the water cooled down. In winter, well, how did you warm some water? And also in winter, how, for God's sake, did you deal... if you didn't want to make tea out of bore water, you had to have the wit to, very often in winter, to put your water out somewhere overnight so that it didn't freeze, because quite often in winter all the pipes were frozen and we could get no rainwater at all. It was rainwater that we wanted to make the tea with, but certainly not bore water. I don't know whether the bore water pipes in our house ever froze. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, I don't know. But certainly the rainwater tank and the rainwater taps did freeze, and we had great trouble in winter. And then, well, how did you light your fire? Where did you get your wood from? Who chopped the wood? Ha ha! Okay then. Milk, what did you do about that? Keeping things cool. Refrigerators? Washing machines? No. You had an ice chest and things like that. And what I wanted to do was to deal with very basic aspects of life. What was in the houses? What could we afford? And we couldn't afford much, I can tell you. That's probably most people in town. I think most people put on a brave front as much as they could. But insofar as what their life may now be seen as primitive, no one complained, because that's how it was. Who complains about life now? Not many. We simply live with what we've got and we think we're at the end of creation. But in 50 years' time, our life now is going to be regarded as rather primitive, and I'm quite sure that if I describe to you life for ordinary people in the 1940s, you'll think that's pretty primitive too, and you'll probably be glad you weren't living in the 1940s. But we didn't complain about living in the 40s, because at that point we were at the end of creation too. The war was going on and things were rationed, and oh dear, what a time it was. And so that's the third part, yes. But I haven't done that yet, but I'm going to start on that. And then, of course, there may be a fourth part, because by that time I will have finished the history. I'll have finished, a recording of the life. And at that point, I'm told, that you can monetize your work on YouTube. You never know. I might start featuring, I might do product placement and things like that. I might become an influencer for fashion. All of those things. That could be a fourth thing I'm thinking about. Okay, but anyway, I should have said this at the beginning. Who am I doing these videos for? Well, I'm not doing them for Brisbane, and I'm not doing them for Melbourne or Sydney or London. I'm simply doing them for Charleville because they won't make any sense to most people outside Charleville, unless you were born in Charleville or brought up in Charleville. They'll be sort of, almost Masonic. To understand, you'll almost need to give a secret handshake or something. No. These are to be understood by Charleville people. And, I hope they understand in charity and they forgive me, because every now and then, I'm 84 and I have seniors moments and I make little mistakes, but people will be witty enough to pick out the mistakes. And when I do make a mistake, for instance, in the one on the 1940s, I said that the Great Charleville hailstorm was... The Great Flood, the Big Flood, was 1991, but in fact I discovered since then it was 1990. There'll be little errors like that, and you'll have to forgive me. And you'll have to forgive me because if I don't do this with all the mistakes that age will bring, it won't be done. And so you're going to have to forgive my inaccuracy sometimes, or sometimes my tongue runs away with me. And I'll describe something and say it happened in 1994 or something, when in fact I'm talking about 1894. Or, I might repeat a name of a report out of place or something like that. I ask your forgiveness, but I'm only doing this for Charleville. Now, some people in Charleville may find it interesting. Some people may say the old bastard, he's senile. Well, I can assure you I haven't quite gone senile as yet. And the other reason you have to forgive me is this, in that I know that if I sit down and write some sort of script, I'm never going to get anything done. So everything I do, I give you from the top of my head. And if my head is a little soft in places every now and then, well, that's something you have to give. But by and large, my head's still in fairly good condition. And every now and then my tongue runs away, or not so much runs away, but what's in my brain and what comes out of my mouth or occasionally they don't coordinate really well, but that's only very occasionally. So I'm not working to any script, and I'm not working to a series of notes that I'm working. The only time I ever use any notes is when I've got a lot of things to talk about and I want to be sure that I haven't forgotten most of them, and so I sort of have a look, have I said this, have I said that, but that's all. But anything else, dates and times and names and all that sort of thing, that's all from the top of my head. And if you're doing that well when you're 84, well, good on you. And so with whatever errors I make, well, let's live with it. Because if we don't live with it, it'll never be done. But while I say I do this for Charleville, I have in mind the fact that when I read about, say, the 1840s or the 1740s or whatever it may have been, I would really love to have, become a sort of resurrectionist or something, and, remove someone from their grave and say, hey, come on, tell me what it was like. What was it like in 1740? What was it like in 1840? How did you cook? What did you do? How did you entertain yourselves? What did you talk about? Tell me some of the stories. Well, of course, I'm not a resurrectionist. If you bear in mind what a resurrectionist is, of course, I wouldn't care to have been one. But I can't bring the, there's no time machine. I can't bring the 1740s back. I can't bring the 1840s back. But what we can do at the moment, we can bring the 1940s back to a certain extent, but certainly 1940s as seen from Lower King Street. And in 2040, people say, oh, what was it like in 1940? And in 2140, people say, oh dear, well, let's go back. And at least someone will have had a go at it. And that's what I'm doing. I'm having a go at it. But I can tell you what, there are many imperfections, but let's live with them, otherwise they'll never be done. So that's what I'm doing. I'm writing, or not writing, I'm talking for Charleville, about Charleville, and only for Charleville. Well, 98% for Charleville anyway. And the other 2% is for the researcher from 2040 or the researcher from 2140. And if I can help that person by what I've got here, then good for them. But I'm not getting involved in sophisticated video editing or anything like that because I haven't got time. I've got too many things to do. And I'm not very interested either. So look, what you see is what you get. So anyway, that's what I'm doing. But bear in mind, most of the stuff, or some of the stuff anyway, is from the point of view of what a 10-year-old saw and heard and understood in the 40s. And so the stories may be accurate, they may not be accurate, or they may be, well, just made up. But not by me, I can assure you. The stories were the stories that were actually told. So that's what I'm trying to do. And then there's that serious history bit at the beginning, because I spent many, many years on that. It took me 3 years to go through the material I wanted from Trove in the 19th century. And that gave me the first 6 volumes of what I've done. And the 7th volume is the record of the Charleville Cemetery through to 1939. But I've done a little better than just give you a record of the Charleville Cemetery burials to 1939. I've attempted to match the information in the burial records with the birth, deaths and marriages records of the Department of Justice here in Queensland, and I've also matched it with the Australian Cemeteries Headstone Index. And if you put all those 3 together, well then, well, you find that there are all sorts of contradictions. You can't entirely trust the information that you get from the Department of Justice, because probably their paper records were accurate, but at some stage they computerised everything. They must have employed sort of casual typists or something to come in and transfer the information from the paper record into the digital record, and they weren't always accurate, I can assure you. So that's why if you put the burial records, the cemetery headstone records, and the Department of Justice records, you'll find where the contradictions are. And then there are all sorts of ways of determining which is probably the more accurate one of the two. But for people who are interested in family history, relying on one source is really not good at all. You can't guarantee the accuracy of the records from the department. Most of them are accurate, but a significant number of them are not. But nor, of course, can you rely upon the headstone information. There's one headstone there, I can't remember the name of the family, but it's got about 3 different people listed on there from that one family. But the amazing thing about it is that every single part of the information that's provided on that headstone is just plain wrong. You know, very, very wrong. And so the headstone must have been put up quite some years after the last person recorded there died, and someone did it off the top of their head, I think, what they could remember, but they weren't remembering all that well. Then there are small areas, like the Switzer girl, the girls who died in were drowned in the Middle Creek drowning. The 3 sisters died in that drowning, and they're over there in the cemetery. And there's just one thing about it. I think it says they died on the 15th, I think, of the month. But in fact, I think it was the 5th of the month. I think what they did there was they took a date from the newspaper that was printed a week or so after that and recorded on that date. And so you can't always rely upon the headstones. And then what's the other one? Oh, the actual burial records themselves. Well, you have to assume that they're fairly accurate, but and really they're probably 99% accurate. But every now and then there was a particularly terribly incompetent clerk was there for a few years. He could barely write, the poor lad. And you've got to remember that a lot of the information that was recorded in those burial records, and on the death certificates for that matter, the information was recorded at a time when, if you died in the morning, you were probably buried in the afternoon. You went down quick, I can tell you, particularly in summer. Although the habit of quick burial was also true in winter, but nevertheless, summer was a bit urgent. And if you wanted to know age or religious denomination or place of birth, or, you know, all of those things, well, very often people had to have a guess because, you know, you didn't have a lot of time to research these things. And so whatever information was available, you know, from a horse ride from the cemetery or the hospital or the undertaker's office was about all you were going to get. And if you could find someone, you know, if someone over on the sandhill died, well, what was his age? Probably no one knew. When did he come to Charleville? No one knew. Where was he born? Probably no one knew. So there are a lot of guesses going on there. So while you must assume that most of the burial records are the information is fairly accurate, you can't be absolutely certain that it was totally accurate because there was a lot of guesswork. And then when you come to the causes of death, well, I mean, if someone died and they were 70 or whatever it may be, heaven forbid that they should be 84, but, well, the doctors of the time, I'm not quite sure who they may have been. I could give you some names, but I won't. They didn't trouble too much about what killed you. They used to like senile decay. God, they could have been murdered. It could have been anything that killed them. But if you're over a certain age, why spend much time worrying about it? Senile decay was a favourite one, and then there was another one. I can't remember the technical term for it, but you know what killed him. The reason is given as you know, heart stopped, syncope, I think, or something. I can't remember what the term was. But I mean, if you're a doctor and you've got to give the cause of death and you say, well, he died because his heart stopped, it's an easy way out, I think. So you've got to take those with a bit of a grain of salt also. So there we are. But anyway, with those provisos, what I'm trying to do is give you a history, give you a view from Charleville, Lower King Street, and give you a record of just what life was like for ordinary people in those 1940s. I'm doing it without any assistance. I'm doing it with a phone, and I'm not going to spend any time tarting myself up for the occasion, and I'm not going to spend any time becoming a technical expert. So what you see is what you get, and if it's interesting, good, and if it's not, well, spare me assassination, because I'd like to go on for just a little while longer.